Howdy, everyone. Um, Steve Robbins here, and I am here today with a pre-recorded interview that I did with Michael Bungay Stanier. The reason it was pre-recorded was because, frankly, we are 14 hours apart, and there was just about no way for us to be able to come together and figure out how to do this when we were both awake and conscious. So we spent weeks finding just enough overlap. Without further ado, I will go ahead and start the recording of the interview. I do want to point out I'm going to be here live. If my live streaming platform correctly does this, and I've never really had it work properly before, but there's a first time for everything. If my live streaming platform correctly does comments, I will be able to answer comments live during the course of the interview, and I will stick around afterwards as well. So let's get going.
People I had to work with, and hi, I am Steve Robbins, and I would love to welcome
Hi, I'm Steve Robbins, and I would like to welcome today Michael Bungay Stanier, who has recently come out with a new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone. And since I am somebody who has had definite opinions over the different courses of my career about people that I had to work with, and I figure we can learn a lot and hopefully take it home and use it. Welcome, Michael.
Steve, it's nice to be talking again.
Yeah.
I'm so appreciative of being on this, and also just aware that how many podcasts have you hosted in your time? Like, is it close to 1 billion?
An awful lot. I certainly did almost 600 audio podcasts, a series for United Airlines at one point.
Wow.
And then these are my own live streams. And then I had a bunch.
Yeah,
a whole
fantastic.
bunch.
Well, I appreciate being here with you. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I appreciate being here with you because one of the things that always blows me away about you when I read your books is that you have a fabulous ability to distill very complex situations. For example, how to have a coaching conversation with somebody into really small, tight frameworks that allow somebody who doesn't innately have those skills or innately have the subtlety that you have to get the same value. So that's amazing.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure anybody's ever said that I have subtlety before, but I'm going to just take that on and own it. But you're right, Steve, I've got a couple of things principles that help me with this. One is I'm trying to unweird stuff for people. In other words, sometimes it's finding simplicity on the other side of complexity. So it's like just trying to make something like coaching or building better working relationships feel more accessible to just normal, regular people. And secondly, when I'm writing a book, part of my mantra is, what's the shortest book I can write that would be the most useful book? So I'm constantly going, how do I make this tighter? How do I make this leaner? How do I give this a cleaner, sharper, more obvious arc to it? I'm trying to do all of these things. So regular people who often pick up a book and they're like, I'm not sure I can read all of this book. I'm trying to make that irresistible so that they read most of the book.
Absolutely. Have you ever read, I believe it's called The Stories of the People? And I think it's by Zena Henderson. It was a 1970s series of books. Basic premise, enlightened aliens crash land on America, crash land on the Earth. They set up their own community and pretty much try to avoid contact with outsiders. And the books are about different Earthlings who encounter them, and they have special powers and all that kind of stuff. But there's a conversation that one of the outside characters has with one of the aliens, in which the alien is trying to explain the alien civilization to an Earthling. And they say, Earthlings are in the age of complexity. In the beginning, you look at a tree and you say, a tree.
Yeah.
And then you break it down and you say, well, it has xylem and phloem, and it has leaves, and it has capillaries, and it has syrup, and you put it all together. And then you enter the second age of simplicity, and you say, and it's a tree. And it seems like you are our catalyst and our conduit from the age of complexity.
I am in fact an alien, and this is the work that I'm doing. So welcome, Earthlings who may be listening. It's great to be walking amongst you.
Yes. A little known fact about Michael, for those of you who are
Yeah,
watching,
exactly.
is that there's this image in the front that appears to be a person. That's actually the background. The real Michael is the mottled color behind.
There we go. I like that. Yeah, that's good.
So when you the premise of your book, one of the places it starts is with the idea of a keystone conversation. And that's something that when I read it, I went, oh, because I don't think I've ever had a conversation like that. Or I've never had someone initiate a conversation like that with me. And I've had pieces of that with other people. But what is it?
Yeah.
How do we use it? Why is it important?
Look, the starting point is our success and our happiness are so dependent on the working relationships that we have. And, if you're listening and watching this, you can think when you think of a really good working relationship, notice the impact that had on your success and your happiness. And when you had a really frustrating working relationship, notice the impact on your success and your happiness. And it's real. But just as Steve is saying, most of us, when we start working with people, we cross our fingers and we hope for the best, and we'll see how it goes. And I think we should aspire to having the best possible relationships with the key people who we work with. Not necessarily the best relationships, because not every relationship is going to be brilliant, but everyone on your bell curve from pretty terrible to pretty great and in between, every working relationship can be better. And the keystone conversation, and this is probably the idea in a sentence at the heart of the book, is have a conversation about how you work together before you plunge into the conversation about what you're working on. And the what always feels like it's the most important. It's shite, it's briny, bright, and shite and briny.
I like that.
That I do too. It is shite and briny, also bright and shiny, and urgent and important and necessary and exciting. All of that is calling you forth to kind of let's get cracking on the problem we're here to solve and the adventure we're about to have. But I think if you can just pause a moment and say, hey, Steve, you and I are working together on this. How do we work best together? How will I bring out your best and how will I avoid your worst? How will you bring out my best and avoid my worst? And how will we fix it when things go wrong? Because things always go wrong.
Yeah. I have a working relationship right now with someone who has brought a number of ideas into the project that we're doing that I vehemently disagree with.
Right.
And that person, interestingly enough, did not bother to consult me before putting certain things in motion, which I now have to follow, because you can't show a divided face to your client. If one person says, we're going to paint your house green, the other person can't come in carrying orange paint.
Right. So
what should I have done?
That's an interesting place to be. And it would have been interesting to have had that conversation with that person going, oh, how are we working together? What happens when one of us makes a unilateral decision that the other one disagrees with? What happens when somebody feels like they've been let down by the other person? How will we have that conversation? Because one of your options at the moment, Steve, is to go and confront that person. Another is to swallow it, kind of hold on to a bit of resentment and anger and kind of go, well, maybe this will pass, maybe it won't. There's different options you have. But if you'd had that conversation beforehand, you'd have gone, you might have come up with some tactics around how you might repair it now. But more importantly, you'd have had an acknowledgement that we'll need to figure this stuff out at some stage. So you now have permission to come back and go, hey, we're doing something work for me. How will we tidy this up and clean this up and resolve it? Or as another way, Steve, you before we got going on this, you're telling me about your book project and you're working with an editor around that. Now, my guess is that when you sat down with your editor, you're like, here's my book. And she's like, I love books. And you're like, I love people reading my books. And she's like, I'll take it away and read it. And you're like, please, because it's good. And I think it can be great. And she's like, I'll come back and I'll let you know what I think. And you're into the book, right? You're talking about how do we get this book sorted as fast as possible.
It sounds like you were a fly on the wall for that conversation, by the way.
Right. Well, because that's how most conversations are going to go. But what if you'd said, look, I'm excited about this book. I'm really keen to show it to you, but let me tell you about what working with an editor at its best would look like for me. Here's what you'd do. Here's what you wouldn't do. Here's what you'd say. Here's what you wouldn't say. Here's how you'd challenge me. Here's how you'd encourage me. Let me tell you about the worst editors I've had and what they did. And so I want you to avoid that. And when we disagree around something, when you're cutting a paragraph and I'm like putting it back in and then you're cutting it again and then I'm putting it back in again, how will we work through that? And what if she'd said to you, let me tell you about the very best authors who I've loved to work with, the ones that I just like, I'm at my best when I'm working with this type of author. How useful would it have been to have some of that data so that you can do the things that you can do to allow her to be the very best editor for you? All of this is in service of the work, but it's also in service of you going, I'm feeling like I have more fun and I'm feeling happier and I'm feeling more successful because we've had a conversation about how we work together.
So I'm curious. So, now I have a bunch of questions. One of them, is it too late to have that conversation? She's in the middle of an edit, but I kind of feel like I want to call her up and say, hey, Nora, tell me at this moment going forward, what would the best author relationship be like for you? And
I think that's a great idea. I mean, that saying, the best time to plant an acorn was 20 years ago, and the second best time to plant it is today. So I think there's any moment where you can say, hey, let's just take a beat and say, I'd just like us to kind of step up a level and go, how are we working together? So you could say to Nora, hey, Nora, I know you're into this. I'm excited by how this is going at the moment. And I've just come across this idea about how do we set our relationship up for success. And here's what I would love. I'd love a half-hour conversation about how we make it the best working relationship going forward from now. And that will freak her out. Well, because you're like, where's this coming from? And is there a hidden agenda? And what am I missing? And does he not
maybe
like
even have
me?
I done something wrong? Yeah.
Exactly. Have I done something wrong? So knowing that, you now need to manage that. You're like, nothing's going wrong. But I've been reading this book and there are 5 good questions that are being asked in the book. And I'm going to think about my answers. Maybe you can think about your answers as well. And let's have that first conversation. And the first time it happens, because you said, you haven't really had this happen before in your career. First time it happens, it's a bit awkward and it's a bit weird and you're kind of finding your way onto new ground. But the more you do it, the more confident you get around how this works and what your answers are and what you're looking for and what you're asking for. And it only gets better.
So if I ask her what would make a good author, what would be, how can I be the ideal author for you? What kinds of answers am I listening for? Because I could imagine her just saying something really vague and nebulous, like, oh, you should be an author who appreciates good editing or something, which really doesn't help me at all being on the other end of that question.
Yeah, so get curious about it. So if she says, oh, I just like an author who likes good editing, what would you ask as a follow-up question to find out more?
Yeah, I'd probably ask, well, what does that look like?
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of an author who does like a good editor and an author who doesn't like a good editor, so I can contrast them and understand?
Exactly. So you just get curious about, all right, that's a really interesting answer, but I need to know more so I can be that person for you. So tell me what that looks like. What do they say? What do they not say? My wife is my first reader of my books. And we've had to figure out how she edits my books in a way that doesn't end in us wanting to end the marriage. Because her natural style is to pick up a red pen and plunge it repeatedly through my heart. It's just her kind of editorial style. She's descended from pirates. And so she's like, aha, I'm bringing my cutlass into the fight. And I'm like, I love that about that, because it's really helpful to have somebody with this kind of blunt approach. And I really prefer just a few words of encouragement before I find out all the ways this isn't working. And it's taken us a bit of time to figure that out. But now she knows that when she's giving me feedback, she's like, let me tell you what I like. And I'm like, great. It doesn't have to be much. And then she's like, and let me tell you what is rubbish about this. And I'm like, okay, that's exactly what I love you for, because you're really good at that. She brings great insight around the flabbiness of my writing at times, or the purple prose that I come with, and all of the stuff that I'm trying to get rid of. But we've figured out how to do that together.
That's interesting because I can easily imagine. I had I had an editor for my first book, which was a book on personal productivity, and I gave her the manuscript, and she read through it, and she said, you have amazing ideas. This is a fabulous book. It's incredible. I only need you to make one or two little changes, and it will be perfect. And I was like, tell me. And she said, well, first of all, I need you to rewrite it from scratch, not even carrying over any of the original text. And I was kind of like, okay, sure. And I was like, wow. She really delivered that one with a fair amount of skill and grace.
What happened? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So, for me, when I'm talking to my wife or other people on my team, I'm like, honestly, blunt feedback is really good. It needs a thin coating of support, but sometimes I'm a bit obtuse and I miss the subtleties. If you're not blunt, I will miss the point you're trying to make. So give it to me straight, give it to me full on. And that's just helpful. But other people might go, you know what? I am feeling pretty delicate about this writing. I need a lot of encouragement and for you to pick the one or two big things I need to work on rather than the 100 small things to tidy up.
Sure. Now, what do you do if you disagree with them? This sounds like maybe this comes under the heading of how do you fix the relationship if something's going wrong, but there will be times when you can communicate, here's how things aren't working for me. The other person is kind of like, well, big deal. You're resisting my great ideas. Get lost.
Yeah. So you go, so what happens when we can't figure out how to resolve this? How do we resolve the non-resolution? What should we do? What should we try and do? And because it's really hard to figure that out in the heat of the moment.
Yeah.
When your little amygdala is in fight or flight mode and their amygdala is in fight or flight mode, it's really hard to go, what's the gentle, kind, open, curious way of us kind of figuring this out? So have a figure it out when you're both feeling pretty good about things, where you're both going, all right, how should we do that? And if you can then say, Wade, when we talked about this, you suggested this. What if we did this and see if that's helpful for figuring this out? You're giving each other permission to keep trying to forge this working relationship rather than trying to resolve it when the wheels fall off.
Well, yeah, it seems from at least what I've seen in coaching other people who are in the middle of conflict, very often, if you wait until you're in the middle of conflict to try to propose a resolution mechanism, even if you propose something that's fair, the other person isn't prepared to trust you. So they assume that whatever you're proposing has some hidden agenda that's going to cause them to lose.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, look, everything you're saying makes perfect sense, feels kind and feels generous, and screw you because we're having a fight right now. And this isn't about rationality or kindness or generosity. It's about me winning a point, proving a point.
Right. So can you give some examples of resolution mechanisms that people have suggested? Because I since this is not a question that gets asked in advance very often, I've not heard a whole lot of different answers to that. I have some of my own ideas, but I'd really love to hear some of yours.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Sometimes time really helps. So it's like, look, if we feel stuck, what if we both agree to give it 48 hours and then come back? Or if we both get stuck, what if we do that thing where we both articulate what we think is best from the other person's point of view?
Ooh, I like that. I haven't heard that before.
It's a debating technique where when you're in a debate, you have to give the most positive summary of that other person's point of view before you respond. So what you're doing is you're responding to the best version of the argument, not easy targets. Right. Or you could say, if we get stuck, what if we go to Joanne and ask her to help figure this out with us? So bring in a mediator or a third party who can kind of break the deadlock. Or if it gets stuck, my decision wins because I'm the boss. Right. So sometimes it's like we get clear around how the hierarchy works, and we just both know that if we're stuck, I get to make the last call because I'm the senior person here.
Got it. Or you could very interestingly decide if we get stuck, the junior person gets to make the call, and then everyone has a learning experience.
Yeah, but that's all hard to do in the moment. So really the power, so in the Keystone conversation, this conversation about how we work together, rather before we jump into what we're working on, there are 5 questions. The 5th question is, how will we fix it when things go wrong? The repair question. And part of the power of that is it's kind of less in the answers you get in the moment, although they're interesting enough. It's more in this recognition that things will go wrong. And we are both saying we're committed to try and figure out how to fix it, certainly at this stage. And that is the thread of hope that comes through the conversation.
Do you ever review the conversation, like as the relationship? And I'm specifically not talking about times of crisis, but do you ever just come back and say, let's just stop and take a pause and make sure we're still both okay with the way that we've decided to manage the relationship?
I love that. And I think that's a critical part of it. So the book's effectively divided into 4 parts. The first part is preparing your answers. So it kind of teaches the 5 questions. And it says, spend some time figuring out what your actual answer is to the 5 questions. The second part is, how do you have that conversation? How do you start strongly? How do you get through the middle? How do you finish with appreciation? So it gives lots of practical, say this, do this, as a way of running the conversation. The third part, and this is what you're talking about, is about maintenance. How do you keep this healthy? Because unfortunately, a Keystone conversation isn't a one and done thing. It is the start of actively managing the relationship. And one of the principles of maintenance is adjust always. So you're always, I think, at its best, kind of checking in, going, hey, Steve, how are we doing? What's working for you? What should we do more of? What should we do less of? And one of the questions that I often ask, particularly my most important working relationships, I'm thinking of 2 people in particular for whom they carry a lot of responsibility in the work that I do. One of the questions I ask often is, what needs to be said that hasn't yet been said? That's a question helpful, I find, to ask, particularly if you're the more senior person. And with both of these people, I'm the more senior person in the relationship. I carry more status and more gravitas and more weight, just because in both of them, I'm the founder of the company. So that's just part of the deal. So it's easier for me to start these conversations, and it's harder for them to talk about the stuff that might not be working quite right. So what needs to be said that hasn't yet been said is this invitation to say, what's niggling you? What's half formed? What's just on the tip of your tongue, but you're not quite sure if there's any there yet? And it allows us just to try and get ahead of things and surface them before they might otherwise appear, so that we can deal with them more quickly.
Now, is that specifically what hasn't been said about the relationship, or what hasn't been said about the work? I used to have a business partner, and we would have an occasional check-in. And one of the questions on our little check-in was, what is it that you're afraid to say to the other person, which is similar to yours, except in this case, it was specifically about the relationship, not so much about the work. And I'm curious as to how your question plays out.
Yeah, I think you can use it in either context. So I don't tend to limit it to relationship or work. I'm like, hey, how are we doing? What, if anything, needs to be said that hasn't yet been said between the 2 of us? And then just to hold it, be curious and, be quiet. What are you afraid to say is potentially a really powerful question, but it also implies that there's a good deal of psychological safety in that relationship already. Because if that relationship feels unsafe to one of the people, I'm not going to tell you what I'm afraid to say if I don't feel safe.
Right.
So you have to, part of what you're trying to build, I mean, this is the characteristics of a best possible relationship. You want it to be safe and vital and repairable. And safe and vital, I think of as being psychological safety and psychological bravery. How do you find the right balance between the 2?
Could you talk a little bit more about the repairability? One of the questions that I've gotten a lot in the kinds of coaching that I do, which tends to be with business people, small businesses around, well, actually not everything, people issues and business issues, but I have many times been asked the question, how do I repair trust? once I've lost it?
Yeah.
And honestly, my stock answer is it's really hard.
Yeah.
Like, tell me about a time that you trusted someone, they betrayed your trust in your eyes. How did they get your trust back? And
if I was to
that's-
ask you that question,
Yeah.
when's there been a time when you felt there's been a tear in the trust and somehow it's kind of got back? What did you notice? What did they do?
Well, so I've usually dealt with that situation if I wanted the relationship to continue by compartmentalizing, by just sort of carving out and saying, okay, this person can't be trusted in the following areas, or or this person will always act in their own self-interest. So I need to be careful about assuming that they're going to do what's best for the business, because what they may do instead is what's best for them. But that's kind of all done with me. I wouldn't say that repaired the relationship so much as I found a way to get what I wanted, which was, whatever the work elements were, while protecting myself against the ways that I now knew they would fail or not be any good. Or
it's a big and complex question because as part of writing this book, I was reading all the people who've written really eloquently about relationships in general. So people like an Esther Perel, or a Dan Siegel, or a Terry Real, or a John Gottman. These are all big names in that Amazon category called family and relationships. And they're talking about marriage and divorce and kids and all of that sort of dynamics. And, their observation kind of across the board is that the relationships that last are the ones that get repaired. And for the most part, we're not that good at repairing relationships. So it's a really good perceptive question to ask, which is like, so how do you go about doing this? Sometimes you're not going to get back. Sometimes you're not going to repair the trust. It depends on the breach and the extent of the breach. Sometimes it's worth the fight, because one of the things that I would observe is we can all give up a little too early, too quickly. It just proves it, or this is a lost cause, or we're all doomed, or now I just compartmentalize it and I'll navigate around the areas that feel dangerous to me. Part of the benefit of the Keystone conversation is you've set a precedent for talking about the relationship, so you can talk again about the relationship. So it just helps with that in general. But if I'd lost, through my behavior, broken trust with somebody, what I'd hope I'd do, and I might do some of the time and probably chicken out some of the other times, is say something like, what would it take for this to get back to where it was? In other words, you stop trying to guess, and you stop trying to do it all yourself, but you actually ask for help
from the other person.
Yeah, because there's something in the act of saying, what would it take, to that expresses a commitment to the relationship. It expresses a degree of vulnerability. It expresses a degree of willing to do the work. And it means that you might save some time from you making up in your mind what's required to rebuild the trust when it doesn't. I mean, is it Gary Chapman, I think, who wrote 5 Love Languages?
I was just about to ask you about the apology languages.
Yeah. So for those, if you're one of those few people who haven't yet stumbled across this book, The 5 Love Languages, he's like, why do people feel unloved when their partner is doing a whole bunch of things? And he goes, look, there are 5 different ways of expressing love that tend to resonate, and people will have a preference for them. It's there's touch, there's acts of service, there's words of appreciation, there's 2 others which I can't immediately call to mind.
Gifts and quality time.
There we go. And the default is we assume everybody likes the things that we like. So if you like quality time, you assume that the thing you should be doing is giving quality time. If you like acts of service, which is my love language, which is like when somebody does something thoughtful and caring for me, that's fantastic. I go, well, that's my job. So, I'll do the washing up around the house all the time because I'm like, this is a small act of service.
Yep.
And so knowing that other person's love language and understanding how they understand and appreciate and feel appreciated, very helpful for you to then do the stuff that makes them feel appreciated.
Got it. I mean, I could even imagine as part of your Keystone conversation, actually saying, what's your love language?
That's
Or,
right.
you know, how do you, because I know that some people ask, how do you like to give and receive feedback? This is a little bit different, though. This is more like, how do you know you're appreciated? How do you know that you're valued? Which is more of a relationship maintenance question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're quite right. So the second question is called the steady question, which is, what are your practices and preferences? And what are the logistics of working with you like? And in that question, you're often uncovering things as prosaic as, what are your pronouns? What's your name? Like, I can imagine there's a whole bunch of times you go, my name is Steva. It's not Stephen. It's not Steve. It's not Steve-O. It's Steva. And I like my full name. I'm making this up, but that's my guess.
Yeah. So far, you're quite accurate.
Yeah. And it's like, for me, I'm like, my name is Michael. And it's not Mike. It's Michael. And by the way, my surname is Bungay Stanier. It's like a double-barreled surname, but with an invisible hyphen. So don't make my surname Stanier, because when I got married, I took my wife's surname. I became Bungay Stanier. That's my surname. And then it can also be like, how do you like feedback? And there's that kind of, I like it blunt. I like it in the morning. I like it over a cigarette, whatever it might be. What are your love languages? How do you be appreciated, and how do you appreciate others? Kind of falls more often under the third question, which is the good date question, which is, what can we learn from successful past relationships? And what successful past relationships will often have is a understanding of, this is how I appreciate this other person in a way that has them feel seen and heard.
That makes sense. So, boy, I mean, I'm of course, as humans do, as you're saying these questions, I'm applying it to myself, and I'm like, what could I learn from my good relationships? And I'm thinking it's funny because one of the things that I could learn that I don't think I've ever articulated before, my top love language is also acts of service.
Right.
And I think when I think about the best working relationship of my life, I know exactly who it is. And he was the only person I've ever worked with where I could say, I need XYZ by next Tuesday. And in fact, interestingly, in terms of logistics, once I made the mistake of checking in with him and said, hello, so I'm going to need this thing by Tuesday. I like on Friday, is it still on time? And he basically turned to me and he said, Stever, I said I would have it for you Tuesday. Do not check in.
Right.
And like, I was like, this is magical. There's this person who actually carries their weight. And that,
Right.
But again, that's because what was important to me was task completion. I could imagine someone else who might want frequent check-ins,
Right.
not for project management reasons, but
Right.
for like, I want to feel like we're working together and I need contact
Exactly.
to feel that way.
So you can imagine in that initial conversation, which is like, let me tell you what drives me nuts. People checking in all the time. It's like, here's what you can take as granted, that I will either have it to you on that date, or I will come and actively manage the need to renegotiate that date. And you're like, perfect, understood. I'll often say to people, look, I'm either fast or slow. I'm either really quick with the turnaround, or I will move into bottlenecking mode and become really slow at the turnaround. If I'm bottlenecking, here's how to manage me. Here's what not to do. Be polite and wait hopefully. That doesn't work. Here's what does work. This and this and this. And then we have this conversation, and it just solves a whole bunch of angst that would otherwise occur in the future. Because I will bottleneck everybody at some stage.
So is that your bad day then? Sorry, no, because the good or bad day doesn't refer to your behavior, it refers to the relationship.
Yeah.
So what would you learn then from the tell me about a bad relationship question?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I'm just in conversation with somebody at the moment, and we're starting to build out a new website for me. So it's a vendor relationship, still an important relationship. I want this to be a good website. And also I'd love to have somebody who becomes my website person who I can trust and go to. So I'm like, let me tell you about what drives me nuts in vendors. This is the behavior that I just find not fireable, because I'm rarely that bold, but just not repeat hireable. You start doing this, I'll be like, great, we've done this project and that's it. Our work here is done. And if you're a vendor, what you want is repeat business. So I'm like, what I'm telling them is invaluable, because I'm like, here's all the ways you won't snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And then I'll say, and in those bad relationships, here's what I would do. Here's my bad behavior. Here's my contribution to those struggling relationships. And then to be helpful, I'm like, so here's how you manage me, because I'll be trying not to do that, but I probably will do that. So when you see me doing that, here's how to call me on it. Here's how to hold me accountable. Here's how to force the issue. Here's how not to get stuck.
I'd love to hear some specifics around that. One of the ways that I tend to fail, that people need to manage me, my view of myself is as a very easygoing, very easygoing, sure, we can do things, blah, blah, blah. But then when someone turns in something that is work that, in my opinion, is subpar, suddenly I flip into the, how in the world could you have been so stupid as to do X mode? Right. And so I don't know how to manage
If I was working with you around that, what would you tell me about how to manage that? Like, how am I going to avoid you going into drama queen, hands waving, you're terrible because this is a substandard piece of work?
Well, first and foremost, do good quality work and check in with me beforehand.
Yep.
To make sure that you're on the right track and that the timing is right.
So there's two things there, because doing quality work beforehand, not that helpful for me, because I know that's the overall goal. We're trying to deal with the fact where somehow I'm off track or I've misunderstood. And the second thing, which is like check in with me beforehand, is really helpful. So for instance, if you've given me 10 days to do something, if I show you where I'm at day 4 and day 8, or day 4 and day 7, is that the right thing to be doing?
Yeah, yes, very much so. And if we do get all the way to day 10 and you haven't, and you give it to me and I'm gonna like explode, probably the way to handle me is just to say, got it, we have a mismatch, tell me what you need, and tomorrow morning I will present you something that is directionally, because let's assume this is something that can't just be done overnight.
Yeah.
But basically start to fix it, demonstrate to me that you're capable of course correction, and you have then postponed the tsunami for another few days.
So can you see how helpful this is for me to work with you, which is like, okay, Steve doesn't like surprises. So if I keep showing him, if I've shown you something on day 7 and you're not happy on day 10, we've got a shared responsibility for that not having quite worked, because we got most of the way and you hadn't pointed out where I was going off track. If I haven't shown you anything all 10 days, that's all on me, because you've given me really clear guidelines around that. If I've screwed up that badly, I'm like, you're saying this, which is like, you need to work really fast to turn something around really quickly to kind of regain my trust and solve this problem. You don't get another 10 days.
Michael, I wish we had had this conversation 3 weeks ago. I am realizing there was a vendor relationship that I was involved in. We did not have this conversation. And what happened was, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I basically said, let's do a little test deliverable, right? Give me one in green. Yeah. And it took 2.5 weeks and they gave me one in blue. Right. And I said, no, I need it in green. And they were unresponsive for 3 or 4 more days. And finally, I called the owner of the company. I said, I've been trying to get this darn thing in green, and they keep giving it to me in blue. And the owner of the company intervened. If instead we had set up progress dates. So after day 4, when I didn't get a response from them, I had immediately gotten back to them. And they had known that that was the expectation. We would have avoided a lot of angst.
Exactly. And you'd be managing it at the level of the relationship, not the level of the green thing. Because the green thing, people can just point out and go, it's blue, it's green. Steve has kind of got his hair on fire. I feel like I was really clear about the process, and you guys haven't followed the process. This is a non-negotiable for me. So this is a working relationship that's not going to work unless you figure this out. Now they're like, right, because work happens through people. That's the key insight here. And we keep, all the conversation is it in blue? Is it in green? Is it this big? Is it this small? What's the resolution? Is it east oriented or west oriented? In fact, you're like, I want all of that, but here's how we make sure we get it done in a way that even if you screw up, a working relationship stays strong.
How have you used this? You did mention, I think early on, if not, I'm putting words in your mouth that hopefully you'll have a good response to, that you use this not just in working relationships, but in your family. You could use it in family and in personal relationships.
Yeah.
How has that worked for you? Can you just?
Yeah, it's, the book is written for working relationships, but it also is about relationships. So there's versions of this that I've had with my wife. But the kind of the biggest story around this, I guess, was like 2 years ago when my dad was dying. And it was a really, he'd come home from the ICU, but he had a terminal illness. He was home. He was mostly stuck in bed. And my mum had moved to being a caregiver for my dad. And I was at home to try and be helpful. So living in my childhood bedroom there. And for all the obvious reasons, it was a bit snipey, a bit snarky at times between the two of them, because so much had changed and so much stress that they were under. And I actually invited / nudged / pushed them into having a conversation like this about how do they want to be with each other in the remaining time that dad had left. And
that's a very powerful question, given the life and death circumstances.
It was powerful, and they were both kind of like resistant, and it was awkward, and we're not a family. There's a whole lot of kind of sitting down and talking about that stuff, so it wasn't like this is a common experience in our household. But eventually they did that, and I kind of was part of it, and as well as a kind of very light touch facilitator. And I think it was really powerful. I think it meant that the memories of those last weeks were as good as they could be.
Sure. That's a very powerful thing. And I'm thinking, I took care of my mother and she was dying. It was I guess actually it was about somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks from the time she was diagnosed to the time that she passed. And at the time, I thought of that as being forever. And in fact, when I talk to people who have been caretakers for years for someone like that, it would it have changed things if we had had the conversation of what can I do, what can't I do, what are the things that will enable me to care for her, et cetera, et cetera.
You're in caregiving mode, and there's a bazillion logistical things. How the meal's going to get provided for? Who's going to cook? Who's going to wash up? Where am I sleeping? How often do I need to change a bed? What stuff gets delivered? What's going to happen to the car? What's going to happen to the house? There's a bazillion details to worry about. And, in the end, the details get figured out one way or another. What you want is for your mum to have the best death and for you to have the best possible experience of being a caregiver to her in those final days. And that's really hard and hard to even speak about. But having a conversation like that gives you a chance to kind of co-create something together.
Yeah. Wow. Well, on that super happy light note, is there anything that you'd like to add? Anything that we haven't talked about that you think is an important check-in?
I'd say the final point I would add is, as people are listening to this, they're probably going, God, this sounds both helpful, and I don't know how to do this, and where do I start? And I'm brought to mind by the statement, nobody likes to be the first to say hello, but everybody loves to be greeted. So if you take two things from this conversation with Steva, or Stevo, as I will now call him, and me, um, one is, it's really powerful to have a conversation about how you work together or how you be together before you get into the details of what. And secondly, be the person who starts this, because it is a great gift to invite others in to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you. I certainly invited you for a conversation, and it has been a delight as always. Where can people find you and your book or books?
Yeah. So if you want stuff about this book, there's downloads, and there's actually a video of me having a keystone conversation at bestpossiblerelationship.com. So you're welcome to jump on there. If you want more about me just in general, my website is mbs.works, mbs.works, and that's a really good hub for all of my books and social media and downloads and courses and other bits and pieces there as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to have you on again when you have your next awesome book.
Thanks, Steve. I hope to maybe invite me on, and I'll interview you about your book that comes out next year, and we'll do a LinkedIn live stream there.
That would be amazing. All right. Take care, sir.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye. Be well. Bye. Hey, so thank you very much for joining me and Michael. I find his approach to relationship and relationship management to be really a refreshing one, because so much of what gets talked about is the idea of, here's how to fix a relationship, or here is how to do things in the moment. And he's really very much preventative. And, I appreciate preventativeness. I personally am extremely lazy, and I know that business about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I have always concentrated on the ounces of prevention. So a pound of prevention is worth a tremendous amount of cure. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Steve Robbins, and I've been with Michael Bungay Stanier, who's, let's see here, can I get I'm not quite sure why, but I can't get the caption back. But you can find his Michael and his book at bestpossiblerelationship.com. That's his new book, which is how to work well with almost anybody. And you can find him at mbs.works. That's MBS for Michael Bungay Stanier. .works. You can find me at steverrobbins, steverrobbins.com. Thank you very much for joining us, and please feel free to write, call, and contact us with any questions, comments, insights, etc. Take care.